A homeless boy forces a millionaire to hide in a trash because of wanting to help him escape from his pursuers. A few days later, the millionaire suddenly sends the boy to a detention center. The city at night had a rhythm of its own, a quiet hum beneath the surface, alive with unseen movement. Neon signs flickered against the damp pavement, casting fleeting shadows that stretched and vanished in the blink of an eye. Somewhere in the distance, a car horn blared, muffled by the suffocating hush of near-midnight streets. Charles Holland barely noticed. His mind was elsewhere, drifting between the weight of business deals and the comfortable solitude of home. The low purr of his luxury sedan filled the cabin, a familiar sound that usually settled him after long hours at work. But tonight, something was off. A glance in the rearview mirror. 2 black SUVs. Their headlights bore down on him, closer than they should be. His fingers tightened around the wheel. It was probably nothing. A coincidence. Then came the first impact. A violent jolt from behind sent his car lurching forward, tires screeching against the asphalt. His body jerked against the seatbelt. Breath caught in his throat. His pulse slammed into his ribs, demanding action before his mind could catch up. He yanked the wheel, trying to swerve out of their reach, but the second SUV was already there, cutting him off. Not a coincidence. The realization hit like a cold slap. They were forcing him off the road. A second, harder collision sent his sedan spinning out of control. The world blurred, metal groaning, glass rattling, the sharp scent of burning rubber. And then, impact. The car slammed into a street lamp, jarring everything into sudden, brutal stillness. For a long second, there was only silence. Charles blinked against the haze clouding his vision. His forehead throbbed where it had struck the steering wheel, a slow trickle of warmth trailing down his temple. The dashboard flickered. Electrical failure. He tried the ignition, but the car let out a pitiful click before falling silent. His hands were shaking. Then, footsteps, fast, purposeful, coming straight for him. Adrenaline kicked in. Charles shoved the door open and stumbled out, his limbs sluggish, his breath uneven. The alleyway ahead was dark and narrow, his only chance. He ran. His body protested every step, the years weighing him down in a way they never had before. The sounds of pursuit, shoes pounding against wet pavement, voices barking orders, grew closer. He could feel them closing in. And then, a whisper from the shadows. "Over here! Hide in the trash can!" Charles skidded to a stop, panting. His eyes darted toward the voice. A kid, maybe 10 or 11, barefoot, clothes ragged, eyes sharp with mischief and urgency. He had to be kidding. Charles hesitated. Him. A man who had spent decades building his empire, who had sat in rooms with kings and CEOs, hiding in garbage. But the kid's hand shot out and shoved him toward the can with surprising force. "Unless you want to die, old man." The footsteps were too close. Charles gritted his teeth and climbed in. The stench hit immediately, rotting food, something damp and sour. He bit down a gag, pressing himself against the cold metal, holding his breath. The kid stepped forward just as 2 figures in dark clothing appeared at the alley's entrance. "Hey, kid!" One of the men's voices was sharp, impatient. "You see anyone come through here?" Ethan barely blinks. "Just me." The man's eyes narrowed. "You sure?" Ethan snorted. "Well, unless you count the rats, but they don't talk much." A beat of silence. Charles, still as death inside the trash can, braced for discovery. Then, one of the men cursed under his breath. Damn waste of time. The footsteps receded, fading back into the night. A few seconds passed before a light kick hit the side of the can. "Coast is clear, fancy old man." The lid creaked open. Charles emerged, dignity in shambles. the scent of decay clinging to his $1,000 suit. Ethan grinned at him. "You smell like a sewer." Charles exhaled heavily, straightening himself. For the first time in years, he had no words. The rain had grown heavier, drumming against the pavement, filling the potholes with dark, restless puddles. The night carried the scent of wet asphalt and something distant, something faintly metallic, city air after a storm, thick with the whispers of distant sirens. Streetlights flickered, casting their glow onto two figures standing at the curb, one rigid with quiet frustration, the other watching him with open amusement. Charles Holland brushed at his ruined suit, though the effort was pointless. No amount of straightening or dusting could erase the stench of rotting food and alley filth. His expression twisted, a quiet battle between dignity and the grim reality of his circumstances. "Yeah," Ethan murmured, arms crossed as he eyed the older man, lips twitching. "You're not winning that fight." Charles shot him a glare, but sighed, weary. He was too old for this, too rich for this. He reached into his pocket, pulling out a dampened wallet, the leather worn at the edges. "You eat yet, Mr.?" Ethan tilted his head, skeptical. "Ethan, and why? You looking for a last-minute charity case?" "I'm looking to eat, Mr. Ethan. I'm Charles," Charles corrected, brushing past the jab. "Figured you might want to as well." Ethan hesitated. He knew a trick when he saw one. And rich men didn't just hand out favors without expecting something in return. But before he could craft a witty comeback, his stomach betrayed him. A low, undeniable growl in the silence between them. Charles raised a brow. Ethan scowled. "Fine, but no funny business." A taxi splashed against the curb, its headlights carving golden streaks through the rain. The driver leaned out, giving them a once-over. His gaze lingered on Charles's disheveled state, then flickered toward Ethan. The mismatched pair raising more than a few silent questions. Neither of them explained. The drive through the city was quiet, except for the occasional gust of rain against the windows. Ethan pressed his nose against the glass, watching the streetlights smear into elongated trails of gold. He wasn't used to being inside moving vehicles unless they were public buses, or the occasional hitched ride in a delivery truck. Then, the car pulled up in front of a house that was not a house. It was something out of a different world entirely. The Holland estate loomed behind wrought iron gates, its structure lined with ivy, massive and glowing softly against the night. The kind of place where no one forgot your name, because people like him weren't meant to step foot inside. Ethan forced his expression neutral, but something inside him tightened. Charles stepped out first, moving toward the entrance with the grace of a man used to being expected, barely acknowledging the opulence around him. Ethan followed, slower, hands shoved in his pockets as though keeping them there would somehow make him less out of place. The door opened before they even reached it. Mrs. Wright, the housekeeper, stood in the foyer, her reaction immediate and visceral. Her gasp cut through the air, eyes wide in horror at the sight of her employer, looking like a man who had crawled through a landfill. "Sir, what on earth?" "Later," Charles cut in, tone brisk but exhausted. "Have the chef prepare something, the boy's eating." Ethan wasn't sure if he'd imagined the brief flicker of shock and disapproval in the woman's expression, but she recovered quickly, nodding before disappearing down the hallway. "You're used to people doing whatever you say, huh?" Ethan muttered as he trailed behind Charles, eyes darting over the polished floors. The quiet wealth pressed into every inch of the place. "That's usually how employment works," Charles replied, voice dry. Ethan huffed a laugh. "Yeah, tell that to my last boss." A few minutes later, the dining room was set, and the smell of real food curled into the air, warm and rich, cutting through the lingering chill in Ethan's skin. He hesitated, the silverware polished, the plates looking too delicate for someone like him to touch. "Sit." Charles's voice was calm, but left little room for argument. He himself took a seat, looking away purposefully, as though uninterested in whether Ethan ate or not. Ethan picked up the fork. He wasn't stupid. This was a moment, and if he hesitated any longer, it might disappear. The first bite was tentative, the second hungrier. By the third, he wasn't even pretending anymore. Charles didn't say anything. He didn't comment on the speed, or the desperation, or the way Ethan's shoulders relaxed the further into the meal he got. He simply let him eat, the silence between them not heavy, but strangely easy. Afterward, Charles stood, rubbing his temple. "You can stay the night. It's late." Ethan paused mid-stretch, eyeing him carefully. "Just for the night," Charles added, as if clarifying an unspoken contract. Ethan exhaled. "Right. Just the night." Mrs. Wright led him to a room that was bigger than the entire apartment Ethan used to share with 6 other kids back at the shelter. The bed looked too soft, the walls too clean, the air too still. He sat on the edge of the mattress, hands pressed against the covers, unsure. Eventually, he lay down, staring at the ceiling, eyes following the patterns of shadows shifting from the rain against the windows. "Guess rich people aren't all bad," he muttered, to no one in particular. But still, he didn't close his eyes. Not yet. The morning passed slowly, enveloped in the silence left by the rain. The storm had not yet broken, but had instead intensified, the rhythmic tapping of the windows of the large estate filling the quiet corridors with a measured silence. Outside, the trees swayed under the weight of the downpour, their leaves slippery and heavy, bending but refusing to break. Charles Holland sat at his desk, the residue of last night's exhaustion still lodged in his bones. His fingers hovered over a steaming cup of coffee, untouched. Instead, his attention was focused on the voice on the other end of the line, deep, brief, and carrying a weight that made even a man like him listen intently. "Find out about the cars last night." His voice was even, but there was a quiet irritation. The private investigator hesitated. No license plate, no security cameras on the road. "Not easy, Holland. You have enemies. I'll start there. There should be a clue." Charles sighed, rubbing his temples. He'd expected that. A man in his position always had enemies. But this felt different, more personal. "Find out and let me know as soon as possible," he said, and ended the call. As he leaned back in his chair, his eyes glanced towards the door. Ethan was standing there, half hidden at the top of the staircase. The boy wasn't fidgeting, wasn't restless like most children his age. He was observing. His posture was loose, but his eyes were sharp, scanning the room like someone deciding whether to step inside or turn back. Charles knew hesitation when he saw it. "You're up early," he said, setting his cup down. Ethan shrugged. Didn't sleep much. He lingered at the threshold, clearly debating something. Charles studied him for a moment, then gestured toward the dining room. "Come have breakfast." Ethan arched a brow. That an invitation or an order? Charles gave him a flat look, but there was something almost amused behind it. "If you want to starve, be my guest." That was all the encouragement Ethan needed. He slid into a seat at the grand dining table, not quite relaxed, not quite tense. The storm outside made the space feel smaller, cozier, the kind of morning where warmth settled in between the spaces of conversation rather than inside the words themselves. Mrs. Wright set down a plate in front of Ethan without comment, though her gaze lingered a second too long. Before she turned away, Ethan picked up his fork, then glanced at Charles, as if testing something. "You don't ask a lot of questions." Charles sipped his coffee. "I don't have a lot of time for them." Figures. Ethan cut into his food, chewing thoughtfully. You're rich, right? Charles barely glanced up. You figured that out all by yourself? Ethan smirked. I mean, this house is kind of a dead giveaway. He stabbed at a piece of bacon. You got a family? There was a pause, a fraction too long to be insignificant. Charles set his coffee down carefully. Not anymore. Ethan didn't push. The silence sat between them like an unspoken agreement. After breakfast, Charles checked his watch. The storm outside showed no signs of relenting. You're staying in today, he said, more a statement than a suggestion. Ethan blinked. I am. It's pouring. Charles nodded toward the windows. No one's going to let you hitch a ride in this weather. Ethan sat back in his chair, drumming his fingers against the wooden surface. There was something wary about his expression, as if the idea of staying in one place, especially one as foreign as this, made him uneasy. But the alternative was wandering the streets in a storm, soaked and cold. So, he shrugged. Guess I'm staying in then. Ethan had never been inside a house like this, let alone allowed to move through it freely. It wasn't just big, it was deliberate. Every object, every painting, every expensive artifact placed in its spot, not for function, but for meaning. He wandered without touching, scanning the endless walls lined with books he couldn't imagine reading, sculptures he couldn't imagine anyone really needing. When he reached Charles's study, he lingered in the doorway. You just gonna hover there? Charles's voice came without looking up from his paperwork. Ethan smirked, stepping inside. Didn't want to interrupt your evil billionaire plans. Charles didn't dignify that with a response. Ethan flopped onto the leather couch. So what do rich guys do when they're not getting attacked in alleys? Charles, still focused on his documents, replied, Mostly paperwork. Ethan glanced at the stacks of files, unimpressed. That sounds depressing. Charles didn't argue. For a while they sat in silence, the storm outside filling the gaps in conversation. It wasn't awkward. Just easy. Dinner came late. Charles hadn't planned to ask, but the words left his mouth before he could stop them. How long have you been on your own? Ethan, mid-bite, froze for half a second. Charles noticed. The boy chewed, swallowed, then leaned back in his chair. His tone was light, but his eyes weren't. Since I was a baby. A pause. Charles set his silverware down. No family. Ethan shrugged. Maybe once. Didn't stick around long enough to find out. The fire crackled softly in the background, casting flickering shadows along the walls. I grew up in a place that called itself an orphanage. Ethan's voice was casual, too casual. More like a prison for kids no one wanted. Some of the staff were okay, most weren't. Charles remained silent. Ethan continued, his words deliberate now, controlled. Figured out pretty quick that no one was coming to save me. So, I saved myself. Charles leaned back in his chair, studying the boy across from him. The way he spoke, matter of fact, as if detaching himself from his own story, was all too familiar. He understood that tone. It was the kind of voice people used when they had made peace with being forgotten. Charles didn't offer empty words. He didn't say I'm sorry, or that must have been hard. He simply nodded, letting Ethan's words settle into the air. Ethan, as if sensing the absence of pity, relaxed slightly. For the first time since he had walked into this house, he felt something strange. Not safe, not comfortable, but maybe less alone. And that was something. The storm had softened by morning, retreating into a quiet drizzle, but the sky remained heavy, low-hanging clouds pressing against the city like an afterthought. The streets, still damp from the night before, carried the scent of wet pavement and something distant, something old, like the weight of a secret no one wanted to name. Inside the Holland estate, the rain had found a different rhythm, tapping lightly against the tall windows, threading itself into the silence of the house. Ethan stood by the glass, watching the droplets race one another down the pane. He wasn't thinking about anything in particular. Maybe that was the luxury of being somewhere warm, somewhere dry. You could afford the quiet. But it didn't last. A car pulled up the long driveway, black and unmarked, its tires whispering against the gravel. Ethan turned his head slightly, watching as a man in a dark coat stepped out, his expression unreadable. He had the look of someone who had spent too much time in the shadows, too much time knowing things other people didn't. Ethan didn't need to ask who he was. Charles already knew. From the study, Charles had seen the car approaching. He didn't rise immediately, instead taking a measured breath and pressing his fingers together in thought. He had expected the visit. It was the answers that remained uncertain. By the time the investigator was shown in, Charles had already composed himself, a man who had spent a lifetime perfecting the art of control. He gestured to a chair across from his desk, his expression giving nothing away. The investigator, Mark Evans, an old name from an old list of trusted contacts, sat without ceremony, his eyes flickering briefly toward the room's surroundings. If he was impressed, he didn't show it. "Talk," Charles said simply. Evans didn't stall. He reached into his coat, pulling out a thin folder, the edges softened by handling, the contents already studied and restudied. He placed it on the desk between them, his voice low, measured. "There's nothing." Charles didn't react, didn't so much as blink, but there was a sharpness in his stillness, a controlled patience, elaborate. Evans sighed, rubbing at his jaw. "I have been searching for the past 2 days, but in vain. Nothing usable. Whoever was behind the wheel of those SUVs made sure of that. No plates, no traceable records. They were ghosts, Holland." A pause. Then, more carefully, "None of your competitors are involved. Some were busy on business trips abroad, some were celebrating their wives' birthdays, and some were busy signing contracts. They were not like the people who had the time to take revenge on him that day. That leaves us with a different kind of problem. This doesn't feel like business." Charles sat back, studying him. "Then what does it feel like?" Evans exhaled. "Personal." The word settled in the room, unspoken, but thick. Charles didn't move, but his fingers curled slightly against the armrest of his chair. Personal. That changed things. A silence stretched between them, broken only by the quiet ticking of the clock on the far wall. Finally, Charles nodded once. "Keep looking." Evans gave a slight tilt of his head, a gesture that wasn't quite agreement, but wasn't refusal either. He stood, smoothing the front of his coat. "You're sure the kid didn't see anything?" Charles's gaze darkened slightly, a warning behind his words. "Ethan has nothing to do with this." Evans didn't push, but there was something in the way he lingered for half a second too long before turning toward the door. Ethan was waiting in the hallway. He wasn't trying to eavesdrop. He didn't need to. People like Evans walked in and out of places like this with expressions that told stories without ever opening their mouths. And right now, Ethan didn't need to hear a single word to know something wasn't adding up. The investigator barely glanced at him as he passed. Ethan watched him go. When Charles finally stepped out of the study, his expression unreadable, Ethan was already leaning against the wall, arms crossed. "No bad guys caught yet, huh?" Charles sighed. "No." Ethan tilted his head, something unreadable flickering behind his gaze. "So, what's the plan?" Charles gave him a long, assessing look, the kind that usually made men shift in their seats. Ethan didn't shift. "The plan," Charles said slowly, "is that you stay out of it." Ethan let out a low breath, shaking his head. Right. Because ignoring things always makes them go away. Charles's jaw tightened slightly, but he didn't argue. He didn't need to. Ethan wasn't wrong, but this was different. He turned, walking past the boy, his words clipped but firm. You're staying here. That's all you need to know. Ethan didn't move for a moment. He just watched him go. Then, softly, to no one in particular. Yeah, we'll see about that. A man sat in the back of a dimly lit bar, the kind where nobody asked questions, as long as the right money crossed the right hands. Samuel Hayes wasn't drinking. Not yet. He was listening. The man in front of him, a runner, someone whose name wasn't important enough to remember, shifted uneasily under Samuel's stare. He had delivered the information, but something about the way Samuel was sitting there, completely still, made him uneasy. You're sure about this? Samuel's voice was quiet. The runner nodded quickly. Spotted the kid last night. He's with Holland. Samuel exhaled slowly, tapping a single finger against the table. So, the old man had taken in a stray. His lips curled slightly, the first trace of amusement breaking through his otherwise blank expression. The old man finally has something to lose. For the first time that evening, Samuel reached for his drink. Now, he was interested. The storm had passed, but the air still held its memory. The sky was pale and damp, the streets washed clean, leaving behind a world that smelled of earth and renewal. Morning sunlight struggled to break through the clouds, casting a dull glow over the Holland estate. The city beyond its gates had already begun to stir, but inside, the world was quieter, slower. Ethan sat in the kitchen, spooning cereal into his mouth as Mrs. Wright moved efficiently around him, arranging breakfast with a kind of practiced precision that suggested she had done this for years. He had never eaten at a table this polished, never sat in a kitchen where the smell of fresh coffee didn't fight for space with something burnt. Across from him, Charles sat with the morning paper, the rustle of its pages filling the silence between them. Ethan glanced up. So, what's the news? Some billionaire forgot where he parked his yacht. Charles didn't look up. A senator was caught in a scandal. Ethan smirked. What kind? The usual. Ethan huffed a quiet laugh. Man, rich people live in a different world. Charles folded the paper, setting it aside. What do you know about politics? Enough to know that people like me don't matter to them, Ethan said, stuffing another bite of cereal into his mouth. Charles studied him for a moment, as if considering how to respond, but before he could speak, Ethan beat him to it. What about you? What do rich guys do all day? Charles sipped his coffee. Work. That sounds depressing. That depends on how you look at it. Charles leaned back slightly, fingers tapping against the armrest of his chair. Work builds things, creates opportunities. Ethan snorted. Yeah? What did you build? Charles met his gaze. Everything you see. Ethan looked around the grand kitchen, the high ceilings, the expensive light fixtures that probably cost more than every dollar he'd ever held in his life. Huh. He took another bite of cereal. You ever get bored? Charles considered the question. I don't allow myself to. Ethan rolled his eyes. That's a weird way of saying yes. Charles didn't argue. Instead, he stood, pushing his chair back with a quiet scrape against the marble floor. Come with me. Ethan frowned. Where? You'll see. They ended up in Charles's study, a room Ethan had been in before but never really entered. The shelves were lined with books, their spines old and worn. Some in languages Ethan couldn't read. There was a fireplace, unlit, its mantel adorned with small things. Not decorations, but objects that meant something. their significance locked away in Charles's mind. Charles walked to one of the shelves, pulling out a book and setting it on the desk. Ethan eyed it warily. "You're not about to make me do homework, are you?" Charles smirked. "Consider it a lesson." Ethan folded his arms. "A lesson in what?" Charles flipped the book open, revealing yellowed pages filled with neat but aged handwriting. "In choices." Ethan hesitated, then leaned over the desk, squinting at the text. "What is this?" "A journal." Ethan raised a brow. "Yours?" "My father's." That gave him pause. He hadn't expected that. Charles turned a few pages, landing on a passage. "He built this company from nothing, worked harder than anyone I've ever known." He tapped the page lightly. But he didn't build it alone. He had people he trusted, people who trusted him. Ethan frowned slightly. And it mattered, Charles said simply. The choices he made, who he let in, who he shut out. Every decision shaped what came next. Ethan studied the page, not reading the words, but watching the way Charles looked at them. "So what's this supposed to teach me?" Charles leaned against the desk, crossing his arms. "That you're already making choices, whether you realize it or not." Ethan scoffed. "What choices? I live day to day." "That's a choice." Ethan narrowed his eyes, but he didn't argue. Charles continued, his voice even. "You could have left last night. You didn't." Ethan huffed. "Yeah, because it was raining." Charles gave him a knowing look. "And now?" Ethan didn't have an answer. He turned away, pretending to study the bookshelves. But something about the conversation stuck with him. Maybe it wasn't the lesson itself. Maybe it was the fact that someone was actually trying to teach him something. Meanwhile, outside the Holland estate, Samuel's men watched. They weren't close enough to be seen, but they were there, parked just beyond the curve of the street, their eyes sharp, patient. Inside, the boy moved too freely. He had no idea that he was already marked. The sun stretched lazily across the Holland estate, filtering through the branches of towering trees and dappling the neatly trimmed grass in uneven patches of gold. The air was crisp, tinged with the last traces of rain, carrying the scent of damp earth and freshly cut hedges. It was the kind of morning that promised normalcy, a false sense of calm that would shatter before the day was over. Ethan stood in the garden, kicking a small rock across the pathway. It had been a strange few days, longer than he had planned to stay, longer than he should have. Yet somehow, he wasn't in a hurry to leave. There was something about this place, about Charles. Not warmth exactly, but a different kind of stability, something unspoken, but solid. He crouched near a small pond, watching the fish dart beneath the surface. They moved with a kind of thoughtless ease, gliding from one end to the other, trapped, but unaware. "You look busy," Mrs. Wright called from the veranda, arms crossed as she watched him from a distance. Ethan smirked, but didn't look up. "Yeah, real productive morning." She shook her head, but didn't scold him. Maybe she was getting used to him too. Inside the house, Charles was preparing to leave. He adjusted his cufflinks, glancing at the time. Another long day ahead. Meetings, decisions, conversations that required more patience than he usually had in the morning. Mrs. Wright stepped into the doorway just as he grabbed his briefcase. "The boy's outside," she said, her voice carrying a quiet note of something unspoken. Charles knew what she meant. She didn't ask if Ethan would be staying permanently. She didn't ask what Charles planned to do with him. But the weight of the question lingered in the air. "I'll be back by evening," was all he said. She nodded, stepping aside as he left. The gates groaned open, the sound sharp against the quiet morning. Charles's car pulled onto the street, swallowed into the city beyond. He never saw the shadows waiting. Ethan barely registered the movement at first. The garden was open, sprawling, the estate's outer fences towering, but not impenetrable. A place like this, so controlled, so removed, gave the illusion of safety. But safety was a fragile thing. The moment the hands grabbed him, Ethan's instincts kicked in. He twisted, fought, bit down hard on the first arm that tightened around him. A grunt of pain followed, but they were faster, stronger. The world blurred. Grass, sky, hands. A rough voice, cursing under breath. A rag pressed against his face. The last thing he saw before the world turned black was Mrs. Wright, rushing toward him too late. The housekeeper's hands shook as she dialed. Charles's phone rang once, twice. He answered, his tone even. Holland. But the moment he heard Mrs. Wright's voice, something in his stomach dropped. They took him. Her breath was uneven, but her words were sharp, precise. They took Ethan. The office walls suddenly felt smaller, the air too still. Charles's grip on his phone tightened. Who? I don't know, she admitted, her voice edged with something raw. Black van. 2 men. I tried. I ran. But they were... She cut herself off, exhaling sharply. He fought. He fought like hell. Charles closed his eyes briefly. Of course he did. His mind moved quickly. Ethan wasn't a target before. This was because of him. I'll handle it, he said, already reaching for his coat. But Mrs. Wright wasn't done. There was something else. She hesitated, and Charles could almost hear her debating whether to say it. They knew where to find him. This wasn't random. Charles didn't respond. He didn't need to. He already knew. Mark Evans wasn't the type of man to be rattled. When Charles stormed into his office, the investigator barely glanced up from his desk, though his eyes flickered over Charles' expression, assessing, calculating. I need you to find him, Charles said, his voice low but sharp. Evans leaned back slightly. You want me to ask the police? No. Evans sighed, already rubbing at his jaw. Then that's a problem. You're asking me to track ghosts. We don't know where to start. Charles gritted his teeth. He wasn't used to not knowing, wasn't used to being the one left waiting. We need something to work with, Evans continued. A name, a motive, Charles's phone buzzed. The sound was sharp, cutting through the room like a blade. He pulled it out. A message. Unknown number. You want the kid back? Come alone. Silence stretched in the room. Evans exhaled. Well, that's a start. Elsewhere, Ethan came to slowly. His head was heavy, his limbs sluggish. The world around him was dark, shifting, the low hum of an engine vibrating beneath his skull. A van, moving, fast. His hands were bound. His pulse quickened. A voice near him spoke, low, muttered. Kid's awake. Another voice scoffed. Yeah? Let him be. Boss will deal with him soon enough. Ethan forced his breathing steady. He didn't know who they were, didn't know where they were taking him. But one thing was clear. They had made a mistake, because Charles Holland was coming, and Charles Holland never came unprepared. The first thing Ethan noticed was the cold. It pressed against his skin like damp iron, the kind that seeped into his bones and refused to let go. His head throbbed, his vision swam, and when he tried to move, the sharp bite of rope burned against his wrists, tied to a chair. He exhaled slowly, forcing his breathing steady, his mind clawing its way through the haze. Focus. The air smelled of dust and oil, of rusted metal and old wood soaked in forgotten rain. Somewhere in the distance, water dripped, a slow, rhythmic sound against the cracked concrete floor. A warehouse, his fingers flexed against the rough rope. Not good. Footsteps. Ethan didn't move, didn't flinch, just kept his head tilted downward, breathing slow and steady. Listen before they know you're awake." The footsteps stopped. Then a voice. "I expected a little more fight in you." The words were slow, deliberate, spoken by a man who wasn't in a hurry. Ethan cracked his eyes open, blinking against the dim light. A figure stood in front of him, tall, well-dressed, but not in the way Charles was. This wasn't tailored elegance. This was something carefully curated to give the illusion of control. His dark shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, sleeves rolled up, revealing tattoos that disappeared beneath his cuffs. The man wasn't in a rush. He stood with the ease of someone who knew he had already won. Ethan swallowed. Not good at all. "You going to stare all day? Or are you going to tell me who the hell you are?" Ethan's voice came out hoarse, rough from whatever they'd drugged him with. The man smirked, amused. Bold. I like that. He crouched slightly, bringing himself to eye level with Ethan, studying him like something under glass. Ethan held his gaze. Never show weakness. "You're Charles Holland's little pet, aren't you?" the man murmured. Ethan said nothing. The man's smirk deepened. "Interesting." He straightened, cracking his neck slightly before stepping back. "I'm going to make this simple for you, kid." His tone was almost friendly, like they were just two people having a conversation over coffee instead of a hostage situation. "You don't matter. Not to me." Ethan clenched his jaw. "But," the man continued, tilting his head, "Charles." "He does." Something in his voice shifted, something colder, darker. Ethan's fingers curled into fists against his bindings. "See, the thing about men like Charles Holland," the man went on, pacing now, hands loose in his pockets, "is that they like to pretend they're untouchable, like they built their world with their own hands." He stopped, turned, met Ethan's gaze. "But the truth is, the people they love, the people they think they can protect." His smirk returned, lazy, amused. "They're always the weakest link." Ethan didn't flinch. He wouldn't give this guy the satisfaction. A pause, a shift in the air. Then, the man's smirk faded, just slightly. He studied Ethan again, slower this time, something behind his eyes calculating, peeling back layers. Something was wrong. Ethan knew it before the man even spoke. "Where'd you come from, kid?" Ethan stayed silent. The man stepped closer, tilting his head slightly, his gaze sharp, searching. Ethan's heartbeat picked up. The way this guy was looking at him now. This wasn't about Charles anymore. A slow exhale. Then, almost too soft. "Why do you look familiar?" Ethan didn't move, didn't breathe, but inside, something twisted, something deep, something instinctual. This was bad. This was really, really bad. The man's gaze flickered, almost as if tracing something unseen, something half-remembered. Then, without warning, he grabbed Ethan's arm. Ethan jerked, but the grip was iron tight. A sharp tug of fabric, and suddenly, his sleeve was pushed up, exposing the skin beneath. For the first time since he woke up, Ethan saw the man's expression change. The lazy smirk was gone. The amusement was gone. All that was left was something cold. The man stared, not at Ethan, at the birthmark on the inside of his forearm. Ethan's stomach dropped. He didn't know why. He didn't know what it meant. But he knew, in that moment, this man wasn't just looking at him. He was seeing something else. Something bigger. Something Ethan didn't understand yet. The man let go, slowly stepping back. Then, a laugh, low, quiet, then louder. He laughed, like he had just heard a joke that took a second to land, like something had just clicked into place. Ethan's pulse pounded. The man shook his head, almost in disbelief. "Well," he muttered, his voice dripping with something Ethan couldn't name. "Isn't that something?" Then, with a smirk that didn't reach his eyes, this just got a whole lot more interesting. The warehouse was a cavern of shadows and rust. Cold steel beams loomed overhead, supporting a roof that leaked in places, allowing thin streams of water to drip onto the concrete floor. The dim light flickered, casting jagged silhouettes across the walls, the hum of a generator, the only thing breaking the silence. Ethan sat tied to a chair in the center of the room, his heartbeat thundering against his ribs. The man, Samuel, had been watching him for too long, an unsettling smirk still playing at the corner of his mouth. But now, the waiting was over. Footsteps. A door groaned open, metal against metal, the sound stretching into the stillness like a warning. Ethan lifted his head just enough to see the dark figure entering the warehouse. Charles. His coat was damp from the mist outside, his steps slow but deliberate. He didn't look rushed. That was the first thing Ethan noticed. He looked controlled, measured, like a man who had already decided how this night would end. But Samuel was grinning. "Well, well," Samuel drawled, stepping forward. "Didn't expect to meet your long-lost son this way, did you?" Charles froze. Ethan saw it, just for a second. That brief, almost imperceptible moment where everything fell apart behind Charles's eyes. Then, just as quickly, it was gone. Charles's voice was steady, but there was something sharp beneath it. "What are you talking about?" Samuel exhaled, almost laughing. "Wow, you really don't know, do you?" He shook his head, running a hand through his hair, as if the revelation was almost amusing. "Figures. You've spent your whole life too far up in the clouds to see the wreckage below." Ethan's stomach twisted. Charles didn't move, didn't speak. Samuel tilted his head. "Let's make this easy. You remember Olivia Green?" The name hit the room like a gunshot. Ethan saw something crack in Charles's expression. Not confusion. Recognition. Samuel's smirk turned razor sharp. "Yeah, that Olivia Green." He stepped closer, slow and deliberate. "She worked for you. Years ago. Quiet little thing. Never caused trouble until you threw her out like garbage. Especially after two people have something together. Not just work." Charles's jaw tightened. "That's not what happened." "No," Samuel challenged, voice laced with venom. "You fired her because she wasn't perfect enough for your empire. Tossed her aside like she was replaceable." His voice dropped, low, dangerous. "But what you didn't know, Charles, what you never bothered to find out, is that she was pregnant. Your child." Ethan felt his breath hitch. Samuel let the silence stretch, his smile widening as realization sank in. "She had me. Alone. No money. No safety net. While you—" Samuel gestured around as if he could summon Charles's entire empire with one sweep of his hand. "We're out building your kingdom. She was drowning." Charles's face was unreadable, but his hands curled into fists. Samuel took another step closer. "And you never even knew, did you?" He let out a breath, shaking his head. "You were too busy playing God to look down and see what you left behind." Ethan's mind raced. No, this had to be a lie. But Charles wasn't denying it. His silence was the loudest thing in the room. Ethan clenched his fists. "You're lying." Samuel's gaze flicked to him, amused. "Kid, you think I'd go through all this trouble for a joke?" Ethan's pulse pounded in his ears. No, this wasn't real. But then he looked at Charles, and Charles looked at Samuel, and suddenly, Ethan knew. Knew that this wasn't a lie, knew that this was real, raw, and burning into the foundation of everything he thought he knew. Samuel scoffed. "What? Nothing to say?" His smirk faltered. "Nothing at all." Charles exhaled slowly, his voice calm, but his eyes dark. I didn't know. Samuel's expression flickered, like something inside him had been waiting for those words. But then, just as quickly, he buried it beneath anger. You didn't care, he spat. You never looked for her, never asked, and she... His voice cracked for just a second before he forced it back, sharp again. She died hating you. Silence. Heavy. Unforgiving. Ethan could barely breathe. Charles stepped forward, his voice steady. What do you want? Samuel's jaw clenched. I want you to hurt. Charles didn't flinch. Killing him won't do that. Samuel chuckled darkly. You think I'm stupid? He gestured toward Ethan. This isn't about killing him. This is about watching you break, watching you feel what it's like to have someone taken from you. Ethan felt his breath come short. Samuel's smirk twisted. You're old, Charles. You could live another 10 years, 20 maybe. But now you'll know what it's like to lose something you never even realized you had. Then, the sound of sirens, distant, closing in. Charles's face didn't change. He hadn't come unprepared. Samuel's expression darkened. You called them. Charles's voice was steady. Let him go. For a moment, the air was too thick to breathe. Then, Samuel moved, fast. A knife, against Ethan's throat. The world stopped. Ethan didn't move, didn't dare breathe. Samuel's voice was ice. I will take him from you. Don't think I won't. Charles stepped forward, just once. Ethan felt the blade press closer. The sirens were deafening. Red and blue lights bled through the warehouse's broken windows, flashing against rusted steel beams and cracked concrete floors. Shadows moved in rapid, coordinated motions. Police officers, tactical teams, weapons drawn. Ethan's breath was uneven, his pulse hammering in his ears. Charles stood in front of him, a solid wall of protection. But Samuel wasn't done. Even wounded, even bleeding, he was still dangerous. The moment the first officer stepped through the entrance, Samuel lunged. Ethan barely had time to react before the cold press of metal dug into the side of his head. The world tilted and froze. A collective breath held in the air. Samuel's arm was tight around Ethan's chest, his grip steady despite the blood seeping through his pant leg. The barrel of his gun pressed firmly against Ethan's temple. Back off, Samuel snarled, voice sharp and wild. The officers raised their weapons, murmurs crackling through their radios. Ethan didn't dare move. One wrong shift, one wrong breath. Charles took a step forward. Let him go. Samuel let out a breathless, humorless laugh. And let you have the satisfaction? His grip tightened. Not a chance. His eyes flicked toward Charles, filled with something darker than rage. You don't get to just walk in here and act like the hero, Samuel spat. You don't get to play the grieving father. You're just a coward who left destruction in his wake. Charles's jaw clenched. I didn't know. Samuel sneered. Yeah, well, that excuse doesn't bring my mother back, does it? Charles exhaled sharply. This isn't what she would have wanted. Samuel's face twisted. For a second, his fingers trembled, just barely, against Ethan's shirt. Then, his smirk returned. But it was different now. Colder. Darker. You want another secret, old man? Samuel murmured, pressing the gun tighter against Ethan's skull. Charles went still. Samuel leaned in slightly, his lips curling. This kid. He's mine. With the woman I dated when I was young. We didn't want to keep our child, so we put him in an orphanage. And then today, right now, there stands a person. Silence. Ethan stopped breathing. Samuel chuckled lowly. What? Didn't see that one coming? His eyes flicked between them, watching as the words landed, hit, and cracked the foundation beneath their feet. Ethan was frozen. His mind refused to process it, refused to believe it. No, it wasn't possible. But Samuel wasn't lying. Ethan could feel it. The way Samuel looked at him, the way he reacted when he saw the birthmark. And Charles's expression was unreadable, but something in his eyes fractured. Samuel's grin stretched, vicious and bitter. Like father, like son. You abandoned me, so I abandoned him. Ethan felt the words settle into his chest like stones, heavy, suffocating. Samuel laughed, but it wasn't amusement anymore. It was something broken. "You see, kid," Samuel said, his tone turning sharp, turning cruel. "You think Charles was going to save you? Think he was some kind of guardian angel?" He scoffed. "He doesn't save people. He lets them rot." Ethan's stomach churned, but he didn't let himself react. Couldn't. Samuel's grip tightened. "And you? You're just another repeat of history." Bang, a single precise gunshot. Samuel's body jerked violently as a bullet tore through his leg, this time higher, deeper. His grip shattered. Ethan ripped away. He barely registered the officers surging forward, the way Samuel collapsed, gun clattering to the ground. The only thing that mattered, the only thing real, was the hands that caught him. Charles. Ethan's chest heaved, raw, shaking, but Charles was there, solid, unmoving. "You're okay," Charles murmured, his grip steady. "I've got you." And for the first time, Ethan believed him. Samuel Hayes lay bleeding on the cold concrete. His breaths were shallow and uneven, his body trembling from the shock of pain. The officers surrounded him, barking orders, weapons trained. But his eyes never left Charles, even as his vision blurred, even as his strength drained. Samuel let out a breathless, bitter laugh. "Too little. Too late, huh?" Charles stared down at him, expression unreadable. But this time, he didn't look away. The sirens began to fade, swallowed by the distant hum of the city. The tension that had thickened the air for what felt like eternity slowly unraveled, leaving behind an eerie stillness in its place. Ethan felt it all in waves, the rush of adrenaline, the sharp edge of fear still pressing against his ribs, the weight of everything that had been said, everything that had changed. And Charles. Charles hadn't let go of him. His grip was firm but careful, as though grounding them both in the moment. Ethan wasn't sure when he'd started gripping onto Charles's coat, fingers curled into the fabric like an anchor. But Charles hadn't said a word about it. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Ethan's breaths were still coming too fast, and Charles, despite everything, despite being a man who had spent decades mastering control, hadn't masked the way his own chest was rising and falling just a little too quickly. They had both almost lost something tonight. Ethan pulled back slightly, his voice rough. I'm fine." Charles didn't loosen his hold, didn't let him go. "You're not," he said quietly, "and that's okay." Ethan swallowed hard. He didn't say anything else. Because what could he say? That he was shaken, that he was angry, that he didn't even know what to do with the truth that had been thrown at him like a grenade, that he didn't want to believe it, that some part of him did? He turned his head slightly, just enough to glance toward Samuel. He was still on the ground, the bullet wound in his leg pooling crimson against the cracked concrete. The officers had him restrained now, his wrists in cuffs, his body weakened from blood loss. For the first time since it all started, Samuel wasn't looking at them. He had turned his head away. Ethan studied him, trying to feel something, anger, hate, even pity. But instead, all he felt was the strangest sense of finality. Samuel had taken him, had threatened his life, had revealed something that had changed everything. And yet, in the end, he had lost. But Ethan didn't know if that made him feel any better. Charles watched Ethan carefully, his gaze following the boy's line of sight. He exhaled slowly. "You don't have to look at him." Ethan hesitated. Then he turned away. And Samuel didn't stop him. Later, the warehouse was behind them. The chaos, the violence, the weight of the past that had bled into the present, all of it was left in the cold metal and rotting wood. Ethan sat in the passenger seat of Charles's car, staring out the window as the city blurred past. He hadn't spoken much since they left. Charles hadn't pushed. But when the Holland estate came into view, something in Ethan's chest twisted. Because the last time he had been here, he had felt safe. Now, he didn't know what to feel. The car rolled to a stop in the driveway. Ethan didn't move to open the door. He just sat there, staring ahead, unmoving. Charles didn't get out either. For a while, the silence stretched. Then, "I want to adopt you." Ethan turned his head sharply, eyes snapping to Charles's face. He hadn't expected that. Not now. Not after everything. Charles met his gaze. There was no hesitation, no uncertainty. Ethan forced a scoff, but it came out weak. "You sure about that? Seems like I come with a lot of baggage." Charles didn't blink. "Then I'll carry it with you." Ethan's chest felt too tight, too full. He had spent his whole life feeling unwanted, disposable, a problem to be shuffled from one place to another. But Charles wasn't looking at him like that. Not anymore. Not ever again. Ethan swallowed hard, forcing himself to breathe. "I don't." He stopped, because the words wouldn't come out right. Because he didn't know how to say what he needed to say. So instead, he just nodded. Just once. And for the first time since the night had started, since the world had tilted on its axis, Ethan saw something soften in Charles's expression, like relief, like certainty, like they had both finally found what they had been looking for. The prison loomed ahead, a cold grey fortress of concrete and steel. The razor wire curled along the perimeter like a silent warning, and the air smelled of damp stone and something metallic. The sky above had begun its slow descent into evening, tinged with fading gold. But inside these walls, time didn't move the same way. Ethan walked beside Charles, his footsteps slower than usual. He wasn't sure what he was supposed to feel. Anger, closure, forgiveness. For weeks now, the world had felt like a puzzle, rearranging itself. The past had come crashing into his present, shifting everything he thought he knew, about himself, about family, about what it meant to belong. And now, this, seeing him. Charles had asked him if he wanted to come. He hadn't pushed, but the way he had looked at Ethan, not demanding, not expecting, just waiting, had been enough. So now, here they were. The guard led them down a dimly lit hallway, their footsteps echoing in the silence. The walls pressed in too tightly. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, flickering slightly, casting shadows that stretched unnaturally across the floor. At the end of the corridor was the visitation room. Through the thick glass partition, Samuel sat on the other side. He looked different, thinner, smaller. The arrogance he once carried like armor had been stripped away, leaving only the man beneath. His hands were cuffed, resting motionless on the table in front of him. He didn't move when the guard gestured for them to sit. For a long time, nobody spoke. Then Charles pulled out a chair, sat down. Ethan hesitated, then followed. Samuel's gaze lifted briefly, just enough to acknowledge them. But he didn't hold it. Charles exhaled, his voice measured. "I'm sorry." The words hung in the air. Samuel didn't react, didn't scoff, didn't sneer. Ethan expected some sarcastic remark, some bitter retort. It didn't come. Instead, Samuel's fingers curled slightly against the tabletop. He let out a breath, not a sigh, not a laugh, just a breath. Then, after a long silence, too late. Charles didn't flinch. I know. Samuel let out a quiet, bitter chuckle. Of course you do. His voice was hoarse, almost fragile, but the sharpness was still there, buried beneath the exhaustion. You always get to walk away, don't you? He shook his head, his fingers tightening. And me? I get left behind. Again. Charles met his gaze, unwavering. That's not what this is. Samuel huffed, shaking his head. No? Then what is it, Charles? He leaned forward slightly. Is this the part where you save me? His words were sharp, but his eyes said something else. Ethan didn't know what made him do it. Maybe it was the way Samuel's voice cracked just slightly. Maybe it was the way his shoulders hunched, like he was bracing for another loss. But Ethan spoke, before he could stop himself. I don't know if I forgive you. Samuel's gaze flicked to him. Ethan swallowed, forcing himself to hold it, to stay steady. But I don't hate you either. A flicker of something passed through Samuel's face. Ethan wasn't sure what it was. But for the first time, Samuel didn't have a comeback. His fingers twitched slightly against the table, and his jaw clenched like he was trying to swallow something that hurt. Then, his gaze dropped, and for the first time, he whispered, I'm sorry. Ethan's chest felt too full, not with relief, not with anger, just something heavy, something real. Maybe Samuel meant it, maybe he didn't, maybe he was just too tired to lie anymore, but it didn't change the past. It didn't erase what had happened. But maybe it was enough to let go. Charles nodded, his voice quiet. So am I. A guard stepped forward. Time's up. Charles stood first. Ethan hesitated. Then, before he could stop himself, he said it. Goodbye, Samuel. Samuel didn't look up, but he nodded, just once. And as Ethan and Charles walked away, he didn't stop them. Outside, the air felt different, lighter. Ethan hadn't expected that. The sky stretched wide above them, painted in streaks of red and gold, as if the world itself had been waiting for this moment to close. Charles glanced at Ethan, studying his face carefully. You okay? Ethan exhaled slowly. Yeah. He didn't know if it was true, but he wanted it to be. Charles didn't push. He just nodded. And then, after a long moment, let's go home. The words sat between them, warm and steady. Home. Ethan hadn't had one in a long time, but as they walked toward the car, something settled inside him. Something solid, something real. He turned to Charles just before they reached the car, his voice quieter now. Thanks. Charles didn't ask for what. He didn't need to. He just placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder. Anytime. And as they drove away, the sky burned with the colors of a new beginning. If this film touches your heart, leave your mark with a like, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel to explore more meaningful stories with us. And if you enjoyed this story, please share it with your friends on WhatsApp. And now, share your feelings with us and tell us your own stories. Every word you share is a building block that helps create our strong and enduring community. Together, we'll create a warm space where everyone can share and connect. Finally, don't miss the incredible stories coming your way soon. We're always here to bring you the best selections, full of deep values, yet entertaining. See you there.